everyone. My name is Kay Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove, and it's a pleasure to connect with you. Welcome to our last key data update of this year. And I have a special thanks for everybody because probably, as you know, we were supposed to host this session last week, but unfortunately last week I got the visit of the popular virus, as you probably know who I'm talking about, the one that we should not name. And for that reason, we had to change it to today. But we're going to have a really, really interesting session. We're really, really excited about this one. Today, we're going to review some of the key data and some of the main lessons of 2022, and also some of the indicators that could tell us what can we expect for next year. So I hope you enjoyed this session. We are recording this session as well, and we're going to share with you all the slides, all the information that is presented in this session. So thank you so much for joining once again. Let me just start going straight into the point for everybody during the session. All right. So today it's all about looking into some of the main trends for 2022, and also to identify what can we learn in thinking for 2022. What are the lessons that actually we can actually take? And definitely has been quite an interesting 12 months for, I think, for everybody, not only for the international education sector. It has been quite a lot of learning that we probably, as a modern society, we had to undertake. And sometimes I have the feeling that for everybody, it's hard to look back. We don't really want to know what happened at the start of the year, that it was a little bit tricky. But in order to really just to plan for the future and to really understand how we are engaging in this post-COVID-19 world, I think it's very useful just to see some of the trends, some of the data, and just trying to understand, what could happen for the next following 12 months. And that's the aim of this session. Now, as probably some of you know, back in February 2020, we at Studymove, we changed the mission of the company, and our main focus, the core focus of our company, has been to assist the international education sector in their recovery. It has been 2 very difficult years that we'll have to endure, and we are really excited to see that, especially in the last probably 7-8 months, we had some really, really positive stories coming from the international education sector. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting session for everybody. And in order to do that, we're going to share also some of the large amount of data. We have been collecting a lot of information from the public domain, all related to international student recruitment strategies. And we're hoping that this will actually help you to complement your own institutional analysis. We know that everybody has different views. This is just something that we see from our perspective, and we are really happy just to share it with everybody. Now, talking about data, and before I really start into the sharing the analysis with everybody, just an update. We are currently working on our 2023 set of reports. As some of you know, we at Studymove, every year we put a large set of reports that are based on information that is in the public domain that really help institutions just to understand the position in the market against other competitors or other peer institutions. And this year in particular, we are very excited because we have a large portfolio of reports available. We're going to share with you some of the links in case you want to visit our data shop. And of course, we can send you more information in regards to each one of these reports that we're going to have available together. And that's why I think it's important just to look back, look into the last 12 months, because definitely we, again, had an extraordinary year. And thank goodness it was an extraordinary year in a very different way, because if you think about it, we were able just to reconnect, something that we were unable to do. We were able to see the return of our international students, which is extremely exciting for the sector. The sector were able just to travel across borders. Sometimes it was only state borders that we could not cross. The effects and the results of that are actually remarkable, and I'm going to share with you some of the data and the results that we have at this stage. And for this presentation in particular, I thought that a good way to present the data is just to split it in two parts. This is a presentation that will take probably about 30 or 35 minutes. Lots of very interesting numbers that you're going to see in the next following minutes, starting with looking back, what happened in 2022, and then looking forward, what can we expect from 2023, where we're going to share with you some of the scenarios that we see for next year, some of the big trends that we think are going to affect the sector in the next 12 months. And of course, as always, we're going to have time for questions and any comments that you want to share with us, because once again, this is what we can see from the data that we collect, but I understand that there are different views, and we just want to try and just to complement what everybody is actually finding at the moment in this re-engagement with international markets. All right, so looking back and thinking about 2022, I think it's very important just to place ourselves on December 2021, where we were 12 months ago. And here in Australia, I know in New Zealand was a little bit different, the story, but here in Australia, this is when we saw the first opening of international borders. This is where Australian citizens and permanent residents, they were the only ones who were able just to travel overseas for the very first time in nearly 2 years. And back then, the mindset of the sector, and this is very important so we can actually understand the lessons, the mindset was all about the return of continuing students. When I remember talking about to education providers all across Australia, and it was the same in New Zealand, the mindset, the aim, it was just to bring back all those students who were stranded or they were unable just to come and have the on-campus experience that everybody was trying to provide. And I think that's a very good starting point. And I think it's very useful just to see what happened in that particular area. And these first charts show you the number of students, or the percentage of students who were inside of Australia and outside of Australia. This is only for higher education during the pandemic. As you can see, basically in March 2020, it was about 20% of students who were outside of Australia, but that number obviously started to going up, and up. And back in 2021, actually just in December, 12 months ago, that's when we actually reached the peak. That's when we actually had a larger number of students as a percentage outside of Australia in comparison to the number inside of Australia. And I think that's why we had that mindset, how we're going to support the return of continuing students. And this is exactly what happened. And as you can see, the trend changed, but it really trended significantly in the last few months. It's something that we really have seen more carefully and more dramatically in the last probably 3 or 4 months. And at the moment, and this is again only higher education figures, for other sectors it's a little bit different, but in the higher education story is telling us that at the moment we actually have about 18% of students from all nationalities outside of Australia. And only these 6 countries that you can see here, sorry, it's 5 of them that you can see here, are the ones who are above the average. Of course, these 5 countries represent a challenge, and I think that's something that the sector will continue working and trying to understand how we can assist those students who are still unable to return. But overall, in this particular metric, I think shows the amount of support that it was put by the sector, but also something that we have been talking about, which is the resilience of international students who wait for so many months, and they were able to return after the difficult period of COVID-19. Now, what I think was interesting is that in February, actually, it was December and February, we started seeing the return of international students, but it didn't take long for the sector just to re-engage with market. And I think, everybody that is in social media could see how rapidly the international education sector went back to re-engage and to reinstall those relationships that they were very important overseas. And this is when it's very interesting to look at the number of students commencing, because this is when I think it's very important just to measure those or the results of those efforts done just to actually not only bring the continuing students, but actually bring a new cohort of students. And in order to understand the results, I think that what is important is just to look at two sets of metrics. The first one, of course, is just to compare the growth that we experienced between 2021 and 2022, but also to complement, it's important just to see how far or how close we are to the levels that we had in the pre-pandemic peak, which it was in 2019. And I'm going to share with you some of the metrics for different particular markets that will give you a very good indication of how we are doing in this particular set of metrics in re-engaging with new students. Now, before I show the different metrics and the analysis, probably some of you will be wondering how he's actually sharing all this if we don't have a complete data set for 2022. Well, I'm just going to share with you the number of year-to-date September, which is usually 95% of the numbers. So pretty much everything that happened in the year could actually be measured in the August and September numbers. So that's why we feel comfortable on give a good indication of what happened in the year using the September and August year-to-date values that I'm going to show you in a second. Okay. Now, let me just start with the growth in commencements. And this is quite an interesting story. This is going back to December. It was all these different speculations and estimates of how the sector was going to react. Are we going to have a quick recovery or not? Well, as you can see here in the chart, this is the number of new students in higher education year-to-date September since 2010 to 2022. We have our peak of 165,000 new students in 2021. From there, numbers kept dropping and dropping down to 102,000. And in 2002, we actually see a very sharp and healthy recovery. And we're at the moment in nearly 135,000 students. As you can see, we can start looking at that V-shaped recovery, which, to be honest, I personally think that it's remarkable what we are looking at it here. It's a very, very quick recovery, the one that we are experiencing in the higher education sector here in Australia. And I think it's quite unfair when you see some commentary saying, oh, why you are not recovering that quickly? This is actually really, really remarkable. This is a growth of 32% more in comparison to 2021, already 5% more in comparison to 2020. And of course, we haven't reached 2019 levels. We're a little bit 20% lower than when we have. But overall, a very, very interesting and a healthy story of recovery for the higher education sector based on this re-engagement with new students. What I think is important is also to look into the detail of this figure. And of course, this is the big picture. And looking at the big picture, I think is very useful to look at the world map. What you see here is basically the growth of every single market for Australia, for higher education, between 2021 and 2022. And every single country that you see in green had experienced a positive growth. The majority of the countries are now on green, different to the picture that we have 12 months ago when the majority were on the red. There are some South American markets down here that they still are they haven't experienced the recovery. A lot of these, like Brazil and Colombia, is because a lot of the students are actually heading more to the vet sector. But close to our region in the Asia Pacific, pretty much everything is on green with the exception of China, and we're going to talk about that. So overall, the map actually shows a very, very positive recovery. At this stage, 135 countries have positive growth and only 29 countries actually have negative growth. So we can actually start talking about an overall recovery of markets for the higher education sector in Australia. Now, once again, this is the big picture, and I think this is when it's very useful just to drill down a little bit more. So moving from the world and heading only to our top 50 markets, what you see here is the percentage growth against last year in commencements. and for the top 50 markets. And each one of these dots that you see here on the screen shows you each one of those top 50 markets and their performance against the previous years. Now, also here, looking only at top 50 markets, a very compelling story of recovery. 44 out of the 50 top markets saw positive growth. In fact, the average growth across these top 50 markets, it was a remarkable 58 average growth, which is exceptional. And actually from the top 50, 15 actually are growing above this 58% average growth. Very important, the story of these two markets, the second source market for Australia and the third source market for Australia, India and Nepal, with significant, actually not significant, very significant growth of 136 and 167. So once again, all across markets, very, very interesting, a very positive story. And, we are very happy to report this after all these years of difficulties. Now, the only thing that is quite interesting, of course, is China. And China, which is the #1 source market for Australia, actually had a decrease in commencements of 13%. And the story of China, of course, changes when you actually put each one of these top 50 markets and you change the dots based on the size of China. Because the 42,000 international commencements from China actually are as big as when you get our #2, #3, and #4 source market. So China is going to be one of those key elements that will actually probably create the path for the next 12 months. And I know that institutions are looking carefully to understand what are the changes, not only on the policies, but also on the preferences that Chinese students may be experiencing as a result of 2 years of dealing with COVID. So it's quite an interesting story. We see very, very positive growth overall, but the top market for Australia, and this is not only an Australian experience, it's something that the UK, the US, and I'm pretty sure New Zealand is also experiencing, is actually need to deal with it, and it's going to be a challenge that we need to deal with. And once again, a good way to deal with it is to drill into the data and to try to understand what's happening here. Something that I'm going to share with you is, once again, the growth of these top 50 markets, but now by study level. And you can see here very clearly that the purple dots, actually, this is the growth of students enrolling into master's programs versus the orange one, which is bachelor's, is obviously more significant when actually we compare one at the other. 98% was the average growth for the top markets in Australia for students who are in postgraduate education versus 33%. And this is actually a very interesting story and shows how COVID creates such a big confusion that we still need to look carefully at the data. Now, this amazing growth in postgraduate education comes for two reasons. First of all, because postgraduate students were the ones who were more affected during COVID. Actually, that's when we saw the most significant drop of students, simply because there was not an incentive to come to a country with border closures, with a lot of uncertainties. So for that reason, it seems that a lot of students actually delay the actual entry. And that, with the effects of changes in the global economy and changes on how mature students are thinking and actually probably demanding more international education services, that's what we have seen creating a larger growth on master student enrollments, or actually commencements, in comparison to undergraduate students. What I also want to highlight here is something that we have been talking for a long time, and I think it's important that education providers remember that it's important to have these two different strategies for undergrad versus postgrad markets, postgraduate candidates. You have very different type of students, that the students who have different drivers, different motivations. So it's important not to put them in the same basket and say, okay, let's just attack this or engage with them in the same way, because there are clear differences between one or the other. And it's going to be interesting to see in the next 12 months to see if this trend changes or not. Also, to look at this detailed data really help us to understand the performance of certain markets, and in this case, the performance of China. As you can see, overall, as I explained before, China had a 13% decrease in comparison last year. But as you can see here on the screen, when we actually see the results for master's students, it was only 3% in comparison to 24% for bachelor, which shows that we really need to start having a separate approach to students based on the study level. Now, looking again into the data, and I think the comparison period by period showed this amazing positive growth with the exception of China, and mainly driven by postgraduate education or by postgraduate students. But I think it's also very useful just to see how far or how close we are to the levels that we have in 2019. This is a really good way just to complement the analysis. And as you can see, looking at international student commencements, once again, this is where we are at the moment. We're about 82% at the levels that we had previously in 2019. So 20% short, and you can see the red line showing that difference. So we are not quite yet. That's something that we expect it will happen. I think I'm going to show you some scenarios, but it could happen next year, but we are not there. What I think is quite interesting is not only saying, okay, well, this is it. It's very useful to see this comparison to some of the key markets that we have. And let me start with China. China, for example, we are 71% in comparison to 2019. And as you can see here, unfortunately, has been a continuous drop on international student commencements from this particular market, which I think, once again, raise a lot of questions. And I think is going to be a key element of what is going to happen in 2023. Now, other two interesting markets, and I think this probably are a better example of how, when you actually see the growth, but also how close we are to 2019, really help you just to understand how markets are changing, are India and Nepal. If you look at Nepal, in Nepal, we're actually currently above 2019 levels. We're 131%, which is 31% more than when we had in 2019, which suggests that probably seeing the growth that we experienced in 2022 may not happen. Maybe we are reaching the level of saturation that this market may offer. And I think this is when institutions there need to consider how many students or many applicants could actually come in the next following years, or they can engage with in the next couple of years, because we already above 2019 levels, which is completely different to what we see in India. In India, we're 65% in comparison to the levels that we had in 2019. So I think this clearly suggests that there is still room for additional engagement in market and opportunities, because we haven't pretty much reached, I wouldn't call it the ceiling, but we haven't reached the peak that we previously had. Other really good examples are top markets like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Vietnam, all three of them, by the way, they're having a little bit of a V-shaped recovery. Vietnam, 94% from the levels that we had in 2019. The same for Indonesia, and Malaysia is 75%. So once again, looking at that data from different angles, I think it really helps just to understand even more how markets are reacting and how you can actually re-engage with these very important markets. Now, in the same way that we are looking at this by study level for each market, I think it's very important just to drill down by fields of study. And what you are looking here is the chart that shows where international student commencements were back in comparison to 2019. And I'm just going to give you the figure for 2021 and 2022. So all the different fields of study that reach this dotted black line basically are reaching 2019 levels. And let me just give you the first example. This is engineer. Engineer students have been significantly affected during the times of COVID. As you can see, back in 2021, we were about 50%, which is half the levels that we had in 2019. And we have seen some level of recovery, but we're not even close to the levels that we had back in 2019. Unfortunately, that's exactly the same situation for IT and management and commerce. And I said, unfortunately, because these three broad fields of study are actually represent 66% of student commencement. So the recovery is underway, but it's not at the same speed for different type of students. And I think this is very important when you are actually talking to particular schools or faculties about what you expect to see in the market and the way in which you are recovering. Other actually fields of study are actually recovering quite well. I think the best example is natural and physical science, nearly close to the levels of 2019, and going back from 75% that we had in 2021, nearly getting to the levels that we had in 2019, and some others like education and society and culture already reaching the levels that we had previously. And you see that amazing growth that it was experiencing in education and also in society and culture. So once again, when we are actually trying to understand what happened last year, I think the key is just to drill down and not only follow the headlines, but see really what's happening for different fields of study or different study level. But, so far, overall, a good recovery. We are underway, but we are not quite yet. And in some fields of study, it has been a little bit different, the story that we see of recovery. Now, just to finish this first part of the presentation, when we actually look not at commencements, not only at the new students, but the actual total enrollments, this is where we at. This is when we actually group the number of continuing students plus the new students, the actual number of enrollments. And as you can see, when we actually group everybody together, we are still dealing with a drop in the numbers. We actually are still 4% compared to 2021. So despite the number of new students are growing, overall, the total number of students are 4% less than 2021, 16% 2020, and nearly 20% to 2019. Now here, I think you will be wondering, whoa, what's going on here? Like we actually seen a very positive story in the new number of students. So why enrollments are still dropping? Well, a story of 2022 that we haven't really talked about, it was what happened in January 2022. We actually saw that from 2021 moving to 2022, we actually saw the lowest number of students progressing or moving to the next year. This was unfortunately, one of the effects of COVID. A lot of students actually withdraw from the course. A lot of students, they probably reduce the duration of the course. So as a result of that, the number of continuing students, which was already quite small, but actually as a percentage was the lowest we have seen in record. As a perspective, we usually have 67-65% of students moving and progressing every year. Well, in 2022, we actually have 59%. So even though we have a large number of new students starting this year, because continuing students were so low, overall, we actually have less numbers than we had previously. And this is important because international fees revenues comes from enrollments, not only new, this is a combination of both. So I think this is why universities are still struggling with lower levels of revenue, even though we see growth in new students. So I know it's a little bit of it's like happy, sad story. It is. So in a really positive way, all the engagement with new applicants is actually looking really good, with the exception of China. But unfortunately, we still have been having some of the effects coming from COVID, which will turn around next year. And that's where we are heading now. After seeing this very significant growth on new students, we saw the return of international students. I think it's important just to take a few minutes just to think about what can we expect in 2023. And there are three sets of metrics that I want to share with you. The first one is what I will call industry metrics, things that are definitely attached to what we do. There are also some mega trends, worldwide effects that will be actually affecting the way in which we operate in 2023. And just putting all those together, I think it's interesting just to share with you some simple scenarios so we can actually have a little bit of perspective of what we can expect for next year. Okay? So thinking about 2023 and what we can expect, definitely, in my opinion, and I think this is actually has been proved in 2022, the best metric that we can follow is the number of student visas lodged. And we actually collect the number of student visas lodged just from the 1st of July to the 31st of October, which is the latest data set that is available. And we took 1st of July thinking about students who are already applying and lodging visas for most likely next year. We know that probably will be some that are thinking probably starting in October or November, but this really gives you an indication of where are we heading. And what we're trying to do with this analysis, it was just to have a little bit of understanding of see if that trend that we saw in 2022 will fade off or will remain for next year. And as you can see, it pretty much is telling us that it will remain because we're actually already having a large number of student visas lodged for higher education that actually represent nearly the levels that we had in 2019 and about 5.6% more than we had in 2022. So this initial indicator is a leading indicator, is telling us that things will continue to grow, or at least this is what we can assume based on this, in the next year. Now, I completely know that there are issues in granting visas and some challenges for certain countries, but this actually just tells us if the demand will continue, and it seems that it will continue for the next 12 months. Also suggests that. What I also think is very interesting is to look at this. When we actually look at the distribution of these, most of these growth in lodged visas comes from students or actually applicants who are outside of Australia. This is a very significant difference to what we saw on the peak of 2019, where about 50% were inside of Australia, 50% were outside of Australia. At the moment, it's about 75% of the students who are outside of Australia, which is telling us that this strong demand is coming from offshore, and we haven't counted the effects of an onshore market that we will start building in the next probably 12 months. It's all these students who come to Australia and they will do an ELICOS program or maybe a VET program or a non-award program that will lead to higher education. At the moment, it's purely from students who are actually outside of Australia, which is a very interesting distinction to have and consideration when we're actually thinking about 2023 already. So this metric shows that things are actually getting close to what we saw back in 2019. But at least for me, something that has been a very important part of the analysis is the demographics. This is a chart that I show a couple of key data updates back in, I think, last year. And this is based on a forecast based by Tourism Research Australia. Tourism Research Australia has been doing every year a forecast of international visitors to the country and visitors that come from tourism, business, or education or other purposes. What you see on the chart here is the 2019 forecast for education visitors. And we have been looking at the previous reports, 2018, 2017. They have been very accurate. And the main driver of growth has been demographics. We are still in a region, which is Asia Pacific, where we have seen a rapid growth in the demographic group that is actually demanding and seeking international education. And we have seen the growth of middle class in Asia. And I don't think this trend has changed because of COVID. COVID actually impacted, but it did not change this demographic chart significantly. Maybe because of COVID, it's going to look like this. Once again, this chart was done before COVID, and it may look something like that, but the natural trend will remain, which I think, once again, gives us an indication that back in 2023, we'll still see continuous growth for services in education. I think that actually is confirmed with the launch of visas that will keep having, a close look, but seems that for the next 12 months, we'll actually continue to see growth for higher education in Australia. And I think that pretty much is going to happen the same for New Zealand as well, which I know it's in a different kind of a stage, but I don't see why it would not be different significantly. Now, following other industry data sets, some of the things that I think are going to be also very interesting, and I'm just going to give you some, initial data on what we already have been collecting. The first thing that we have seen for 2023 is that we have seen an important readjustment in the pricing strategies from universities. A lot of universities here in Australia, they did not update their fees for 2 years. So now they actually have been basically adjusting their pricing just to catch up with the market trends. And also because they have institutional goals and financial goals. So at the moment, and we're still waiting for, I think it's 9 universities who have not updated 2023 fees. But anyway, at the moment, we are considering about a 4% growth into international fees on average. But it's going to be very interesting how this pricing will change and the adjustment that everybody will be doing for next year. Very interesting also is the next one, which is scholarships. And on that, we are about to finish and to release the 2023 International Scholarship Reports. This is one that I personally think I got it wrong, because in 2021, I thought, that's it, borders are open. We're going to see that the scholarships will start to fade away. But it didn't happen in 2022. And I can report you now that it's not happening in 2023 either. We have seen the same level at this stage of scholarship offering for new international students, especially in Australia, for 2023. And I think that's a conversation. And I know there are a lot of questions or reasoning behind this. And we actually need to think what's happening there. But that's exactly what we are going to see in 2023. Is still an active use of scholarships just to support international student recruitment strategies next year. And the other one that I just want to mention, and we haven't started collecting this data, but I think it's going to be very interesting to see, is what is going to happen in the area of articulation and recognition of prior learning. This is a report that we put together in 2021. And what I'm interested to see is what are the new ways in which universities are going to engage in this space. And I think that everybody knows that transnational education is going to be an important part of the different things done for international education, both in Australia and New Zealand. But I think it's going to be very useful just to understand how we're actually going to do this differently. So overall, the industry data, in my view, suggests that things are actually going to continue to see, we're going to continue to experience growth in international commencements for the next 12 months. But I think it's very useful just to look at some of the, what we call the mega trends in 2023, just to see how some things in the world are going to affect what we do in international education. And this is because, believe it or not, we are fading away from the cloud of COVID, but now we're actually dealing with a massive energy price shock that is the result of different things. The conflict in Ukraine is one of the main issues that is affecting the world economy. And all those are creating 3 effects that are going to really be important, or at least are going to be in the mindset of international applicants. I think these 3 that I'm going to share with you not necessarily are going to affect the way you operate, but it's actually going to be things that we believe international applicants are going to have in their mindset. So as a result of that, unfortunately, the world is actually slowing down in their recovery. We are all still going to have the effects on inflation for quite a few months, probably for at least the first half of 2023. And there's still going to be some interesting questions about employment. Now, I'm going to talk about inflation, which is a very interesting topic for international education, and we did a key data update a couple of months ago. But starting with economic growth and employment, what the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the OECD, all the big economic agencies are telling us is that the mindset of employment and employability has changed significantly around the world. And it has been a recovery that it has been uneven. So yes, a lot of countries are having lower levels of unemployment, but that not necessarily is going through all sectors. And now employers are actually having difficulty to really provide what the people who work for them are actually willing to have. Here in Australia, as we all know, we have skill shortages issue, and that's going to be one of those things that I think is going to play in the mindset of international applicants. Those things are actually be considered, and I think that, and there's already evidence. Rob Lawrence shows some very interesting analysis of how on the main drivers of international students, and I think this in particular goes to mature age applicants, is what are going to be the employability outcomes of what I'm doing. And I think that's something that we talk about all through 2022, but is going to be very, very present in 2023, simply because the employability options across the world are changing, and now actually applicants are looking at international education and connecting that quite directly and strongly. So just important just to have that as one of the mega trends for 2023. But the other one that is quite interesting is the topic of inflation. And we all have been dealing with the effects of a higher cost of living. And of course, international students are actually dealing with that. But what I think is quite interesting is this weird relationship that is creating the inflation for places like Australia and a little bit like New Zealand. Because, of course, cost of living has increased all around the world, but in relation to other study destinations, we're actually better off. For example, I'm sharing here the results of Sydney from the Mercer 2022 Cost of Living City Rankings, and there are a couple more that actually show something interesting. So back in 2021, Sydney, which is the most expensive city in Australia, was in the top 30 in the world. So now, although the cost of living in Sydney is increasing, it hasn't increased as much as other cities. And therefore, now it's probably ranked in the top, it's actually ranked number 58, so in the top 60. So it's relatively more affordable in comparison to other destinations. So in comparison to last year, it's more expensive, but in comparison to other destinations, it's more affordable, which is this very weird combination of, it seems that Sydney is better off in comparison to others, but still cost you more to live here. So how we're going to communicate that to international applicants, I think is going to be very, very important. And this is not only the story of Sydney. Every single city from Australia and New Zealand listed in the Mercer 2022 cost of living had that experience. Canberra, 75 to 104, and Wellington is now in the 120. Okay. All right. Now, just to finish this presentation, I thought it was going to be important just to put some simple scenarios. We're not doing sophisticated, econometrics here. It's just to put some perspective of what can we expect. And as I explained previously, at the moment, the number of student enrollments have continuously been dropping. We're in 347,000, or that's what we expect it will be the end of the year figure. So what can we expect for the next year? So as I explained, part of the problem that we had in 2022 is that only 58% of the students from 2021 moved to 2022. We're expecting to have, at the end of the year, 141,000 new students. At the moment, we're in 138. So, this is what we expect to be the end of the year figure. So for next year, moving to 2023, let's just move the bars. it's all about how many students are going to continue. As I said, historically, it's about 67, 68%. If we actually go back to that, kind of close to those levels, and we actually have 65% of the students moving next year, I think we're actually going to be able just to see for the first time in 3 years, or actually 4 years, 3 years, sorry, growth in the student enrollments here in Australian higher education. And this is why. Let's just look at this scenario. 65% of the students move to the next year. So that means that we need 121,450 new students just to really have the same levels that we had in 2021, which is below the numbers that we already is very, very, very possible that we're going to see for the first time in quite a few years growth in student enrollments. In fact, if we get exactly the same number of new students that we get in 2021, we're going to have finally, for the first time, positive growth of 5.6%. Now, I still think that 141,000 new students, could be a conservative figure. We have been doing a little bit of additional analysis and looking at how the top markets for Australia are performing. And even if we still see the number of students from China probably being flat, I think we're going to actually be able just to see, and this is for me, the most likely scenario. You can have a different view on that. But I think that for the first time, we're going to see not only growth in the student enrollments, but I think we're going to see double-digit growth reaching 161,000 new students. So not close to 2029 numbers. We're not even close to 2020 numbers, but a significant push in comparison to what we experienced previously. Okay. So just to finish, and I think that you'll have time probably just to digest all this, but it's quite obvious that the recovery is underway, and that very significant re-engagement with markets in 2022 is already providing some very positive results. And the efforts actually done in previous years just to remain the link with markets are actually giving some positive outlook. And I really commend, and I think everybody should talk about how this industry has been reacting so professionally with less resources, and they're still looking at the well-being and to the re-engagement with international applicants, and the numbers are showing that. So I think that we should say congratulations to everybody involved, the federal government, state governments, and of course, education providers and all the stakeholders who have been involved. But I think it's important that in the next few following months, we still look at these detailed data just to understand the changes in study levels, fields of studies, and different markets. And I think that for next year, we're still going to be looking in detail to how the Chinese market will change or not. Also how the onshore markets, and I think this is for Australia and New Zealand as well, they will re-emerge, and how there's going to be this distinction between undergrad and postgraduate students. And, you know, just a reminder that this is just the general big trends. Institutional efforts at the end, they make a distinction. You know, I think how differently everybody's re-engagement will provide a different result for everybody, but we're just trying just to provide just a general outlook of what's happening out there. And that's it. I hope you enjoy this key data update of the year. It has been a privilege just to assist this sector, especially for these other 12 months. And we look forward just to assist you in 2023 and actually help you in your journey and to assist the sector in the further recovery that we are pretty sure we're going to experience in 2023.